Welcome to Conversations from St. Norbert College, a program that encourages good discussion in our community on today's local and global issues. Now, your host for Conversations from St. Norbert College, author, professor, and nationally known sports economist, Dr. Kevin Quinn.
Welcome to Conversations from St. Norbert College. I'm Kevin Quinn. Our special guest is the Most Reverend John R. Manz, Auxiliary Bishop of the Archdiocese of Chicago, and we'll discuss his life in the church and his ministry to Spanish-speaking Catholics. Bishop Manz was chairman of the Committee for Church in Latin America of the United States Catholic Conference of Bishops, is a member of the Migration and Refugee Services Committee, and has served on the Administrative Committee. He is presently a member of the Pastoral Care of Migrants, Travelers, and Refugees Committee. Each year, St. Norbert College honors an individual who has been an influential advocate for sustainable peace in our world. Bishop Manz, congratulations on winning the Ambassador of Peace Award. Welcome to the program.
Thank you very much.
And welcome to St. Norbert College.
Thank you.
Well, let's start off by talking a little bit about where you grew up and when did you know that you wanted to become a priest?
Well, I grew up in Chicago up until I was about 11 years old in what we call the North Side. And then we moved to Morton Grove. About that time I was in 6th grade. And somewhere in 8th grade, I think I had, the inkling or the desire to go to the minor seminary at Quigley. My parents were not really in favor of it at that time. They just said, why don't you go to a regular Catholic high school and see if, you're too young yet to know what you want, which is true in a way, although you can have a dream even at 13. So then I went to Quigley, which was and still is the minor seminary. Wait, I dated myself. No, that's right. We don't have Quigley anymore.
It was Quigley North at the time, right?
No, when I went there was only one Quigley when I started. So that was how it began. So then as I got involved more, it got. I began to want to stay on, but for more different reasons. Initially, it's a kind of a vague kind of a calling, and after a while, you meet some priest, and you see what they do, and so that kind of encouraged me to continue.
So, how did going to that high school compare to any other Catholic high school?
Well, at that time, they made it sound real special because we had to go to school on Saturdays and off on Thursdays. So, we had. Nice thing, I used to like to play sports, so we'd have some gyms to ourselves on Thursday because everyone else was in school. But I don't know. I don't know if that necessarily helped or hindered one way or another.
And then you went from there to Niles College, is that right?
Niles College Seminary, which just started a couple of years before that, just for 2 years. So. And
then the seminary at St. Mary's after that?
At Mundelein, at St. Mary of the Lake in Mundelein, which is still there. For 6 years, the last 2 years of undergrad, and then 4 years of graduate school in theology.
So what was it like to be at St. Mary's? When I was a kid, when a family had a boy that went to St. Mary's, everyone spoke in very hushed tones. It was such a wonderful thing for a family to have. What was the experience like?
Well, it was I went through transition there to almost every place because that was in the 60s and there was a lot of transition then. When I first got there, it was very strict. For the first year, we rarely could even leave the grounds. Our parents could come to see us once a month. Very, very strict, very enclosed. But then during that year, at the end of the year, it changed and it opened up more. So we had more freedom, you might say, and which maybe went too far at the time. But it was good for me. I think that it was a good experience. A beautiful place, 1,200 acres, a huge lake, obviously, St. Mary of the Lake, and I like nature and all that, so you had plenty of that around. So it was good.
So when were you ordained a priest?
1971.
1971. That was kind of an interesting time. That was there was a lot of upheaval, I think, in the Catholic Church at the time.
Well, yeah, the late 60s and early 70s, there was a lot of upheaval, a lot of priests leaving the ministry, religious women leaving the ministry. Yeah, there was where I went, my first parish, the two previous associate pastors had left. So then when I got up to the people and said, well, I'm going to be here hopefully for 5 years, some of them kind of said, well, we'll see.
So where was your first posting?
It was at a church called Providence of God, which is on the near south side, 18th Street, which at that time was very poor, kind of a port of arrival for immigrants from Mexico. It had been founded by Lithuanians. There was very few of them around at the time. I think for about a year or two we had some Lithuanian hymns at Christmas. That was about it. The school was staffed by nuns who were Lithuanian American. But basically the neighborhood had become, it's right where the Dan Ryan Expressway came in. When that was built in the 50s, it basically eviscerated, you know, the parish because it cut it in half. And so the buildings were old and you know, the community was old, but the people coming in there, and actually the housing was not as expensive, so that's where they came.
And did you know at that time that you wanted to start working with Spanish-speaking Catholics, or did that evolve as a result of your being there?
No, that came earlier, much earlier. Back when I was probably at Niles, as a matter of fact, in about 1964, 65, the religious women there were from Mexico that staffed the kitchen, and I was assigned to work in the kitchen, to be the head of the student part of it. So that kind of, you know, the desire to communicate kind of motivated me. I think, you know, it's one thing to learn a language, just I like to learn this language, but if you learn it to be able to communicate with someone, it's more of a motivation, you know, and they were very helpful in teaching me more informally. They'd write down phrases and that would help me, and then of course they'd laugh at me when I'd make mistakes. But if you know that somebody cares about you and respects you, you don't mind that if they're gonna, because I think that's something that impedes a lot of people from learning a language, another language, is that they don't want to be embarrassed. I mean, adults, a child doesn't care. You know, that's why I guess 3-, 4-, 5-year-olds, you know, can learn so quickly. One of the reasons, because they'll make a mistake and just keep going on, and you know. But we get too self-conscious older.
Well, especially Americans too. I mean, it's very easy to travel in a lot of places in the world and only speak English.
Yeah.
I mean, that's changing in the U.S. now, but I think that's probably why fewer Americans seem to speak any other language.
Yeah, we do. Well, as you know, like Western Europe, because the countries are so small and close to each other, I think that lends itself to it too. But and I guess I had the advantage because I started learning when I was younger, so you can pick up more of a natural accent. You know, the younger you are, the older you get, as you try to learn another language, you're never really going to be completely fluent in it. I mean, you may know it, read it, write it, but if someone listens to it, they can tell, you know. So, but then after that, I got interested in student projects that were going on in Mexico, and I was going to go for one of them, and then that year my father died, so I couldn't do that, but I ended up, I'm trying to think, 65, 66, working in projects around. I had work, but some of the work I had was with landscapers. Most of them, the workers were Mexican, so, and then a couple of years later, I ended up going down to the valley in Texas. I had wanted to work with Cesar Chavez, who at the time there was a great boycott, but that particular summer he wasn't organizing, so I went to the Valley of Texas, and that was very interesting, right on the border, literally, I mean, right at the Rio Grande. So talking to people, I used to go house to house, visiting people. They thought I was a Jehovah's Witness, you know, because they didn't say, if you're Catholic, why are you coming house to house, you know? And I said, well, just to invite you to the parish. And that pastor at that time was gone. He He was from Irish descent, and he was back in Ireland. And matter of fact, that was the first homily I ever gave. It was in Spanish, and I was, a second-year theologian. That was about a week or two after Bobby Kennedy was killed. So that was part of I stuck that in the homily, because I know that at that time Hispanic peoples had great affection for the Kennedys, you know. So I remember that very well, that first time. And a little cultural thing that's interesting, many of the more traditional Mexicans, you know, when they see a priest, take his hand and kiss the hand, just like in some European countries too. But when I was standing there outside of the church that morning after my homily, a woman came up and tried to kiss my hand, and I pulled it away from her.
Oh boy.
And she said to me, "I'm not doing that for you, but for who you represent." And that stuck with me ever since, you know. I mean, don't get a big head, fella, she's saying, you know. It's who you represent. You better represent them well.
Well, let's talk about the farm workers that you worked with. I mean, obviously, something about the relationship that you had with the religious that were working in the kitchen in seminary and the landscaping folks connected with you. What was life like for a lot of Mexicans, the farm working Mexicans here in America in the late 1960s?
Well, it's interesting, just to even go a little bit back. When I was at Niles, I had to do a paper for sociology, and I wanted to do it on the Mexican migration to the United States. I could find 2 books on it. That's it. That's all there was.
Wow.
In the late 60s, then it mushroomed, you know. There's all kinds of writings on it from then since then. But yeah, again, well, my own family, especially my mother's side, comes from farm background, you know, so I always had an affinity to that. And I think when I was in the valley, there's many of the homes there, the small homes that I visited, many of the people were gone. They were north, up in Idaho, Washington State, you know, doing seasonal migrant work. So that, you know, captured my imagination. I just got to, and then I worked with a youth group in a parish in northwest, the northwest side of Chicago. And most of them had come from migrant families as well. So I don't know, it just began to interest me. Again, when you know individuals, you know, you come to as time you come to love them and concern for them, that draws you more into their life, you know, and so you want to know more about it. It's another version of, maybe it's a priest's version of falling in love, you know. You begin to love and interested, and you want to know more about them and more about them. So I mean, in a way, you can't talk about groups that way, but that is made up of many, many individuals. So I think that I'm trying to get my chronology right, because then when I was in the parish, I was not so much dealing with migrants as immigrants, many of whom, you know, they had migrated there, but most of them weren't stable, even though the adults would say, I want to, I'm only going to be here 4 or 5 years and then go back to Mexico. Well, you know, for most of them that never happened, because as they were there, they realized that the children were growing, and as the children got older, and they said, well, we don't want to go back to Mexico, and so they're educated here, and even more so when grandchildren came, you know. So that's how that happened. So my first 3 parishes were all in Hispanic neighborhoods in Chicago, primarily Mexican, but I worked with Puerto Ricans in the diaconate program, and there are other Latin Americans in Chicago, not in huge numbers, you know, but also with that, of course, there was always in those 3 parishes a small remnant of people from, you know, my first parish, Lithuanian, the second was Polish, the third, people of Czech descent, you know, St. Agnes of Bohemia, where I was pastor. So there were those people, and it was especially important to try to be sensitive to them, because most of them tended to be older. They had grown up there. Their children are now gone. The children had moved away. So they sometimes felt they were the minority. Well, they were. Mm-hmm. They were the minority. They sometimes felt left out. So then, you know, like I say, I mean, I'm called to be a priest, not not for any one particular group, but for anyone, you know, who happens to be there. So, and there was always some tension between the groups. Although at each parish I got to, by the time I got there, the Hispanics were usually the majority. But still, you deal with that tension. You know, why did they come here? I remember one woman in the hospital saying to me when she was of Polish descent, well, why did they have to come? You know, they said, well, if your folks didn't move out, I said, they wouldn't have come in. I mean, because that's part of the reason, you know. So, but then my connection more with migrants as such began again when I became a bishop. Because then we began looking at a larger scale at the whole country. Again, many of the people in the parishes that I was at had been migrants, you know, it worked seasonal labor and things like that, and then they got out of the migrant stream. Most do that as soon as they can, not all, but most do. And but then becoming a bishop is when I got more involved with, again, with migrant workers as such, and the whole concept of migration. You know, whether it be within the country, you know, migration from the country to the cities, and of course with Latin America. I had traveled there before. When I was still in the seminary, I spent 6 months in Panama. So that opened another vista to me to the Central America situation, and you know, visited some Colombia and Venezuela. So when I was a priest in parishes, most of my traveling was back and forth to Mexico or Puerto Rico. But then since a bishop again, now I've been visiting more throughout Latin America, the different countries there. You see the migration phenomena is strong everywhere, you know, because those that have been coming here, excuse me, obviously so many that are here now are from Mexico, but there's a huge number that have been coming from Central American countries, you know, Guatemala, Honduras, El Salvador. Not so much from Nicaragua, because Nicaragua tends to migrate into Costa Rica, you know, but, so I mean, that's, yeah, that kind of, I guess it fascinated me, and because I knew so many people that were involved in it personally, you know, it made it more something I wanted to learn more about.
Very interesting. You are watching Conversations from St. Norbert College. Joining us is the Most Reverend John R. Manz. Well, let's talk a little bit about the path and the church's role from the Cesar Chavez and the farm workers up through the liberation theology movement in the Catholic Church. And I mean, obviously, your career and your life has intersected with that all the way through. But what's your perspective on that?
Well, liberation theology kind of hit strong when I was in Panama, which was the late 60s. When was I there? 69. And I think that is the year 69 or 70 when Gustavo Gutierrez wrote Theology of Liberation, which was considered at the time the key book. And the priests I was working with in Panama were quite open to that, most of it.
And basically the idea is that oppression is and poverty is rooted in sin. That's the idea.
There's a connection with it too, that we need to look beyond personal sin, you know, and realize that there is, in a sense, a collective sin, often coming from neglect, or people even unaware, like we talk about racism, you know, institutional racism. The people working there may not personally feel racist, but the structures, you know, eliminate some people or put them, ostracize them, or put them on the margins, whatever, give them less importance. So theology of liberation came in, and of course in Latin America, even more so than here, often the church was identified too much with more the wealthy, and it was much more people were nominally Catholic, and so it wasn't quite as dynamic. It was beginning to lose some of its energy because it had been Catholic for so many years, centuries in some places, you know. So there was kind of an awakening, and realizing that some of the problems, or whether some of the poverty, on the positive side, meant that the church should get involved to try to overcome that poverty, use the influence of the church to help people to be aware, also to be aware of themselves as agents, not just what is the church going to do for me, but how are we as church going to do something about this. So I think, you know, Gustavo Gutierrez, who I met, matter of fact, I took a course by him in the 70s. He still is, I don't think he's in Peru anymore. He's in his 80s now. But I never felt that he was outside of the church at all. I mean, it was part of the difficulty, the conflict with many people later on was that part of liberation theology had to do with the formation of base communities, because you come into some of these parishes in big cities, you know, whether it be like Sao Paulo, Brazil, you know, or Mexico City or whatever, and there's huge, you know, 40,000 people in a parish. Well, I mean, there's no way that any priest is going to be able to come to know them. So you'd have to develop, you know, lay leaders. So development of leadership that came through there and through the base communities. But also there was enough folks smart enough to know that that could also be a way to be infiltrated by some Marxist ideas. If you recall, I mean, in 1959, Fidel Castro, you know, came into Cuba, and of course Cuba, a very strong communist presence, and it went out from there. So there was that influence there. That was just 10 years before then, the whole specter of communism. And it was a real specter. There was a lot of the communist ideas, and some said, well, it's really, you know, very much like the church. The church is really communal. Well, it is communal, but I mean, basically, ultimately, the communist ideal is atheistic as well, you know, so that eliminates it. But if you talk with many of the points that Karl Marx even made, I mean, I don't think many people would disagree with, because he was in England at the time, and in the 1860s, and he saw the oppression there, all the factory workers and child labor and all that, and he said, this isn't right, this something has to change. So I think it was people like Gustavo Gutierrez and even Leonardo Boff and a few others, and many others, that began to say that the church needs not only to speak out against this as sinful, you know, but also look at itself and see how can it change, you know, to bring people around to that. So now, you mentioned Cesar Chavez. He began more in the 60s. I'm trying to remember, that would have been a little bit before liberation theology. I don't connect him with liberation theology, because I would connect him more with the labor movement here in this country, whether it be Saul Alinsky or even though he was very much influenced by Mahatma Gandhi, just like Martin Luther King was. But there's a different tradition there. Liberation theology, it never really rose here in this country very strong. It was imported because with all the problems we have had, we didn't have the oppressive situation that there was in Latin America. And also, in this country, the church, the Catholic Church, is not a majority, it's a minority. You know, so there was a majority, and a majority who was not doing enough, you know, about that, not aware of that. So Chavez followed more the Alinsky model, except Alinsky himself, you know, he worked in Chicago, where I'm from, did a lot of good things, but he was of Jewish descent, and as far as I know, I've read a couple of his books, at least an agnostic, maybe an atheist, but he worked for humanity. I mean, he had tremendous goals and to help people. Whereas Chavez was a very serious Catholic, you know, but so he used some of the techniques, just as Martin Luther King did, and then drawing from Gandhi, you know, nonviolent resistance and things like that. So they're not really connected in a way, but, you know, when people see the confrontation, I think maybe sometimes they connect it.
Well, that whole situation sort of came to a head in Latin America in the late 1980s. And do you remember, were you here in the U.S. when the Jesuits were killed in El Salvador?
Yes, I was. I've been there a couple of times, or 3 times, to the place where the Jesuits are buried, and also I had the privilege of celebrating Mass in the chapel where Romero, was killed. Ironically, there's 3 of us bishops who are celebrating Mass with the Archbishop of El Salvador, who was the spiritual director of Oscar Romero. That was 1981, as I recall. And, when Romero was saying Mass at this same altar at this small chapel, about 100 feet away is where the car stopped, and they shot him right during Mass. It's a very powerful thing to hear the Archbishop, who knew him so well, describe that right at the spot. And then the Jesuits also, and then of course there were some American women that were also, a couple of years later, they were assassinated there as well. So that was a big, that was, they call it the civil wars, of Guatemala and Salvador. They were in fact civil wars, I mean, mostly in the 80s, but from repressive governments. And again, now some of the Catholic Church got involved, and many of them from outside, and I think, sadly, some of the bishops responded too slowly to that. As a result, it's interesting, while some of the Catholic Church focused on a liberation theology, which many of them did because they saw the oppression, at the same time, some of our North American Protestant brethren realized that there was an opening, and they did a lot of evangelization. And so now, at this day, Guatemala is probably almost 40% evangelical, and Salvador to a lesser extent. But I mean, while many in the Catholic Church were focusing on the large social issues, they were coming in talking more about personal, your personal relationship with God. And you really can't eliminate either of the two. I mean, somehow we have to be aware of our personal situation in our relationship with God, but also the society we live in. So, but that was kind of a, and there was, others murdered. I mean, the bishop that oversaw the investigation of the massacres in Guatemala, he, of course, was murdered after the study came, as to who was responsible, which happens in a lot of countries where there's the terrible massacres. The people in charge drift away, they wash their hands, and they're never brought to justice. Because I mean, it was just, the militia would be that you couldn't, the campesinos, the simple people, could not tell who was the difference. I mean, were these the government or these the anti-government forces? And they'd come into a village and take over. And are you with us? Are you against us? And if you're against us, well, we're going to kill you and throw you into the mass graves. Same thing has been happening in Colombia. I mean, it goes on all over the place. So there was a repressive regime, and yet at the same time insurgents that were trying to take over, and which were often very communistic. But then, of course, you could call that the repressive regimes more fascist too. I mean, the classic, right and left wing kind of a thing, but people caught in the middle, most of them.
Fortunately, we're out of time, but I do want to say thank you for all the work that you do on behalf of these people. This is really a wonderful thing, and I'm glad that you were recognized with the Ambassador Peace Award here at St. Norbert College. Thank you for doing the show too. I hope you enjoyed our show. Until next time, I'm Kevin Quinn. Best wishes for good conversations from St. Norbert College.